we're going to talk about what's new in WCAG 2.2, which is the new version of the web content accessibility guidelines that is due for release early 2023. So it's not going to be anything kind of super in depth. It's just going to be introducing the new success criteria and any that have changed that are coming, just to get a better idea of what we might be able to start like designing for, watching out for when we build and design things, or when we're looking at clients' existing sites or like potential partner sites that we might be kind of taking over. Also, I don't want to go too massively into depth as well, just because it's still in kind of like a draft proposal phase. While I mean, there is like a release candidate version for it, but things still might change before it actually gets officially released. And there is, as you'll kind of see as we go through, there are some of the success criteria that people aren't like not best pleased about, but are a little bit complex, and so there has been suggestions to make those a little bit simpler to understand. So just be aware that that might happen, but anything that does change, I'll kind of feedback in another session. And I'll probably do another session on top of this as well when the release is actually announced, to go a bit further into depth into what was agreed in the final release candidate. So just a little bit of a brief overview about what WCAG is. So yeah, it stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So what is that? There's a little bit of text here. Sorry, it is a reader, so I'm gonna read it out. Otherwise, it probably won't get visited again. So Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG 2.1 covers a wide range of recommendations for making web content more accessible. Following these guidelines will make content more accessible to a wider range of people with disabilities, including accommodations for blindness and low vision, deafness and hearing loss, limited movement, speech disabilities, photosensitivity, and combinations of these, and some more accommodation for learning disabilities and cognitive limitations, but will not address every user need for people with these disabilities. These guidelines address accessibility of web content on desktops, laptops, tablets, and mobile devices. Following these guidelines will also often make web content more usable to users in general. So yeah, there's a link here to the guidelines where you can find that explanation as well, a little bit more information about what they are and how you can learn a little bit more. The official doc site does tend to be quite sort of technical, and it's not, in my opinion, presented in the most understandable and logical way. So I will sort of share some more links around as well, around sites that kind of break it down a little bit easier and an easier way to understand in a more presentable way that don't look actually like specifications, which I think if you're kind of new to the area, it can be a bit daunting seeing these like really technical specifications. There's a couple of sort of sentences that I've highlighted there. So guidelines are a great starting point, but they're not. You could create an inaccessible experience but still pass these guidelines. So they're a great starting point, and there's some great kind of standards to follow, but they're not the be all and end all. They should be exactly that starting point for some guidance, rather than, yes, just because we've ticked all these boxes, our experience is fully accessible. It might not be the case. And also just following these guidelines will often make web content more usable to users in general. So I think sometimes our partners can maybe struggle to understand maybe why accessibility is important, but it can help everyone. So if we all work together to do the right thing, everyone can win. So some terminology around kind of WCAG and the guidelines. So we've got version numbers. So the first one was 2.1, which is the current standard that was released in 2018. So with 2.2 just coming early this year, hopefully you can kind of see that these things do take a long time to change, because they need obviously testing, research, people to agree on them. So yeah, 2.2 coming early 2023, and also there is proposals for WCAG 3 as well, but that will be a few years out. And obviously with like it being a major change, major version, there are going to be quite a lot of sort of major changes. I think the way that like color contrast scores are calculated is going to change. So that'll be a massive update, but that is a few years out yet. So yeah, 2.2 this year, and current is 2.1. So there are kind of 4 overriding principles when we think about the WCAG guidelines. They are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And you'll often see that the acronym PAW used for those. Inside each of those principles, you then have 13 guidelines. So these are things like keyboard accessible, for example. Inside of the guidelines, you then have testable statements, which are called success criteria, and these are numbered. So when you'll often see like 4.1.2 name, role, value. That's a success criteria. Yeah, kind of jumped ahead a little bit with when it was on the quote slide, but yeah, guidelines are just a starting point. They're not the be all and end all. I think an accessible culture and understanding is more important than just stringently sticking to the guidelines, but they do offer us a really good starting point. Yeah, so WCAG 2.2. So yeah, as mentioned, early 2023 release. It includes one change to WCAG 2.1 and adds 9 new success criteria. So what we're going to do now is just going to step through each of those and just find out a little bit more about what the criteria involves, why it's important to users, and how we might be able to kind of start preempting this coming and think about it when we're designing and building things. So the most important thing when thinking about accessibility in the guidelines is sort of who's it going to affect, and WCAG 2.2 kind of addresses kind of 3 main groups of people. So people with cognitive or learning disabilities, people with low vision, and people with disabilities on mobile devices. And it does that with these kind of 6, what I'd say like themes of the success criteria are. So it's kind of designed to make keyboard focus states more visible, avoid reliance on dragging movements, ensure controls are sufficiently sized and spaced out, display help mechanisms consistently, let users authenticate without cognitive tests, and avoid asking for repeated information. So yeah, from the quote, it kind of said that like some sort of cognitive and learning disabilities were sort of covered with WCAG 2.1. This is kind of building upon that and has a bit more focus on those kinds of like cognitive neuro issues. So this is the change. So focus visible in WCAG 2.1 is a AA requirement. This has now been moved to just A requirement, which is great, because it means level A is basically a minimum amount that you need to be doing for accessibility. So the fact that having visible focus states is now moving to that sort of lowest category, the minimum, is brilliant. I've labeled this one up a little bit because this is the kind of format I'm going to follow for the other success criteria. So you'll see on the left here, we've got the guideline name and number. So 2.4 is the number, navigable is the guideline. Inside of there, then they've got success criteria number, which is 2.4.7, and the conformance level, which in this instance is A, and then focus visible is a success criteria name. So yeah, just to kind of explain that a bit, because it's the same format for all of them. So this is our one change. So yeah, focus visible being promoted from AA to A, which is brilliant. So why is this important? How can we go about making sure we achieve this? So people with low vision and sighted keyboard users, without focus, how are they supposed to know where they are on the page? We need to have visible focus states on all our interactive elements. So I think one of the ways we can do that is in the design systems or style guides, whatever we want to call them, when we create those, make sure that we're including focus states for things like buttons, text inputs, form controls. We often, I know, do like hover states, active, pressed, but just make sure that focus is one of those states. So when a developer takes that, when they're first kind of setting up a project, they know when they're setting up the buttons, the form inputs, they know what the focus states are going to be, and we can clearly set those. The default browser ones will pass guidelines, but don't necessarily always assume that they can be relied on, especially as another focus one that I'm going to talk about that's coming in 2.2 is going to kind of allude upon a little bit. It might not always pass with the background color that you've got on your site, for example. So although they are good fallbacks, like don't necessarily assume that you can rely on them. So the first new success criterion 2.2 is it's in navigable again. It's 2.411, and this is a AA requirement, and it's focus appearance. I'll be honest, this one I'm still actually trying to kind of wrap my head around fully. It's one of these ones which is worded very strangely in the specs, and it's got a lot of like exceptions. So it's got its main sort of criteria statement, and then it's got a couple of like unless or where. So yeah, I am going to try and do a little bit more digging around this, give some more information when I like know exactly what's going to be needed. And unless anyone has done any reading into it or does some reading after that and can help me kind of understand it or word it and explain it, I've popped a link on here, and this is kind of one of the ones that is it's in the specifications, it's labelled as at risk of changing before it's released. And this is because a lot of people are seeing this as too complex. Like, there's great meaning behind it, I think, but I think the way it's been worded and implemented is possibly a little bit too complex. So again, it's similar to Focus Visible, but kind of builds upon it a little bit. So rather than just having some visible focus states, we need to make sure that these focus states are really clear. So without clear focus states, again, people with low vision or relying on keyboard navigation might not be able to tell where they are on the page. And yeah, this success criteria aims to improve focus, visibility, and contrast. So it must now be like a full solid border around the full element, not overlapping or cut off in any way. However, it can be dashed or dotted if it meets a certain thickness. Or 8 pixels width on the shorter side. And so these are like two of the things that I'm kind of still trying to wrap my head around. I'm not entirely sure what it means by the shorter side, and I couldn't see anywhere what the thickness it was, if it needed to be dotted or dashed. So we'll do some more reading around those, but yeah, the essence is that it needs to be either a solid border or fairly thick. So it must have a 3:1 contrast ratio from its unfocused state, and it must have a 3:1 contrast ratio with all background elements. And again, there's another kind of exception here, or it must be 2 pixels or greater around the full element. There feels to me there a lot of space for ambiguity. So yeah, I will do some more reading on this one, but essentially it's all about making sure that the contrast state between unfocused and focused from the background elements is really clear, which is a reason that I think the browser defaults might not always be the best solution, because I think on Chrome and like Firefox, it's like a blue or black outline that it provides. But if the element that your input, for example, is sitting on, and the contrast isn't great between that, then that would fail the success criteria. So again, 2.4 navigable. We've got 2.4.12, which is AA, and this is focused, not obscured, minimum. So when we think about things like sticky headers, sticky banners, cookie consent, often these, when they follow you down the page, and if you're using a keyboard to tab through, because these kind of just stick on the top or bottom of your screen all the time, they can block elements being focused at the bottom of the screen. I think we've seen this on previous projects in the past. There's kind of two versions of this. So you've got minimum, which is a AA conformance level, and then you've got enhanced, which is AAA. So this is just a no-nonsense version of the AA one, but these are considered two separate success criteria. So in all honesty, it's probably going to be AA that we need to be most concerned about. But I don't think there's any harm when we do think about these things in trying to aim for AAA if we can. So yeah, if an element is partly or fully blocking another element's focus state, it could cause people to miss that focus state. And if you're relying on the keyboard alone, again, you're not going to be able to see that element's focus. You might lose where you are on the page. So the AA one, which is minimum, so this is if the whole element is blocked or obscured by user-created content. Enhanced is if any part of the element is blocked or obscured by user-generated content. So I've got an example coming up of a screenshot of this. But things we can be kind of doing is, obviously when you're building your sites, we're getting a lot better with our accessibility testing, and people are now testing with keyboards, which is great. So if you have got any sticky elements on your site, it's either one to have a conversation with the design about if there's maybe a better way to present that, or just make sure you're doing your keyboard testing and making sure that there's no interactive elements with focus states blocked by your cookie banner, any sort of like sticky CTA you might have at the bottom with like quantities on product pages and things. A lot of the sites that I'd kind of suggest, if you're looking at things like cookie consent, the BBC and the .gov UK site, they actually have their cookie consent as like the first element on the page, and it's not sticky, and user focus is on that as soon as they land on the page, so it doesn't follow you down, it's not getting in your way, and it's almost like when the user first lands on the page, they then make their cookie choice straight away, and they can decline it or accept it, and it just disappears. So I think that's a really nice way to get around having to have like a sticky cookie banner, for example. But I know that a lot of the time we do use third-party ones, so that's just something to bear in mind there. So this is an example that I saw of this when I was just recently looking at the Iceland site. So this is an example that would fail the AAA version because you can see on the bottom left there, our company is a focus link in the footer, but this kind of user generated sticky content is blocking part of it. Like there is a little bit of a layout in this footer, so it's a columned layout and there's links behind there. So if I start tabbing through those, they're going to be completely blocked. I'm not going to be able to see them all. I've got no idea where I am on the page. That one would fail the AA conformance. So hopefully that's like a good visual example of what that one means. Guideline 2.5 input modalities. So this is 2.5.7, and this is a AA requirement. This is dragging movements. So if you think about dating apps like Tinder, navigating a map, price range sliders, things where you're kind of forced to do dragging movements, there needs to be an alternative, like single pointer event alternative for this. So on Tinder, like it's left and right dragging, but you've also got like a cross and a tick button that you can click to perform the same action. That's what's going to pass this. So not everybody has the ability to perform dragging actions. People with mobility conditions, such as hand tremors, may struggle and could miss out on vital information. You know, if the only way to see it is to drag it. Yeah, I guess just make sure when designing and building a component that includes dragging features, that there is an alternative to do it. So if it's having to drag something to like filter by price or something, just make sure there's a little button maybe to the side where you can step it up instead of having to drag it. Again, 2.5 input modalities. 2.5.8 is another AA one, and I think this is one that I think this is very much needed. So this is minimum target size. So this is to kind of tackle very small sort of icons and buttons that are spaced really closely together. And again, there are some exceptions which we'll go through on the next page, but I know that Designer are already doing a great job of this. I think they kind of follow the 44 by 44 pixels rule anyway, which I think is in like Apple's UI guidance. There is actually a AAA version of this success criteria, which already exists in WCAG 2.1, and that is 44 by 44 pixels. So if we're already following that, then we're already meeting kind of like the AAA version of this. But this is one that's been brought into, make sure there's a minimum size, so people aren't just absolutely tiny icon buttons and things. So yeah, small and very close together click tap areas can be troublesome for people with disabilities, again, such as hand tremors. People might have less coordination, larger fingers, and so the size of pointer inputs is going to be 24 by 24 pixels. And there's a few exceptions for this. So when the target offset is at least 24 pixels, so if the gap between the end point of your first element and the start point of your next element is 24 pixels, they could still be smaller than 24 pixels. To me, that doesn't make sense, like just make them 24 pixels, but it's an exception to the guideline. If it's in a block of text, so obviously if you've got a big paragraph of text, you've got a link inside there, there's no minimum size for that. That's just like it's a plain text link in a body of text, so not one to worry about. If it can be achieved if that functionality of that smaller control could be achieved on the page with another method that is at least 24 by 24 pixels, that'd be like an exception for it as well. If it's user agent controlled and you can't modify it, or if it's an essential piece of information that can't be modified, and that is required, and that without it you wouldn't be able to perform the action on the page. So again, there's like a few exceptions to read into there. When I go do a session when this actually gets released and go further into it, then I'll provide some examples of some visuals for that. But yeah, I think the main takeaway is it's just making sure that we keep to those like minimum size for icons, icon buttons, click areas and things. So 3.2, this guideline is predictable. This is 3.2.6. This is going to be a level A, and it's consistent help is the criteria name. So Murphy's Law is if something can go wrong, it will go wrong at some point. So make sure people can find help easily and consistently. I think this is something that I don't think personally we need to worry too much about. We already do this anyway, as far as I'm concerned. What it involves is making sure that if you've got any sort of help on your site, so like an email address, a phone number, a form field to fill in, a chat bot. Just make sure that they're in the same place on each page, and they're not changing, where they're located. Normally we put things like this in like the header. You'll have like the phone number, email address and stuff. So that's going to be the same on every single page. So as long as they're not moving around and changing. The reason being that it can be more stressful for people with cognitive disabilities if they don't know where the help is. If something does go wrong in the future or has gone wrong for them, it can be a real reassurance and just provide a better experience for people on a site. So if we go back to, I don't know who saw Roger's brilliant presentation on designing for autism. One of the things he mentioned on there as well was about how people with autism can like consistency, making sure that navigation and things are in the same place on each page and not switching around all the time and having to find it again. So this is exactly the same, but for help. So if someone does run into problems, they know exactly where to find it on the page, and it's just a less stressful experience. So 3.3 is input assistance.
Quick question on that last one, Jim.
Yeah.
Sorry, I came in late, so I don't know if you're wanting people to hold questions or whatever, but I've jumped in there.
Yeah, no, go for it. Yeah.
Do you know if there's any like points around how that might work with if you had like sub-sites or campaign sites, or even if you're in the middle of a migration from one design to another or something like that? So some page might be in one and some page might be other. They're the kind of spots where I see things being in different locations, and I don't know if there's any allowances for those very common use cases.
Suppose for like a sub-site or that'd probably be treated with its own set of like conformance level, I guess. In terms of like, and actually just you mentioning that is a great point, because I just thought about stuff like A/B testing. So if you're A/B testing a slight layout change or something, that's probably something I'll have to take away and have a look at, to be honest. But yeah, I didn't actually think of that, and that's a really great question. So yeah, I'll take it away and see if I can find anything on that. And yeah, I'll do that. I'll kind of raise that in a further session. But yeah, that's a good question. Thanks. So 3.3 input assistance. So this is another AA one, and this is accessible authentication. So it's about not relying on cognitive function tests to authenticate something. So requiring someone to solve a puzzle or remember a password. There's again two different levels of this and the two different success criteria. So there's a AA one, and then there's a no exception AAA one. So yeah, people with disabilities can struggle with cognitive issues. These can make remembering numbers, strings, passwords, solving puzzles much more difficult, and it can cause a lot of stress. So the more ways that you can try and provide someone to authenticate, the more likely they are to find a way that works for them. So making sure that they can use a password manager, OAuth. I've seen sites in the past, and especially on my iPhone, I'm not sure about Android, but when you get like a code to log in, you get that text message, and then on the site, it says like fill in this from text message, and then you can just pop the code straight in. Face scan, fingerprint scan, making sure you're allowing copying and pasting on password fields. These are all great examples of just ways that we can make sure that people can authenticate. The AAA one, the AA one will allow like recognizing objects and also recognizing content that you've filled in, but the AAA one will not do that. So what I'm going to be interested to see on this one is if things like is it the reCAPTCHA, the Google one, where you have to me, that the way I'm reading that would pass AA, because you're recognizing objects where it's saying like pick out all the trees or whatever, but that isn't allowed in AAA, so it wouldn't pass that. So I'll be interested to do a little reading on that and see if Google will possibly be looking at that when this comes out. But for AA, that would be absolutely fine, because you're recognizing objects, so that's okay. So again, another input assistance one, 3.3.9, and this is level A, so your basic requirements. So this one's redundant entry. So check and plan for autofill, pre-populating of known or saved data. So filling in forms can be really cumbersome, even just on like mobile, and for kind of sighted and mouse and keyboard users. But for assistive technology, this can be even worse. So allowing autofill and populating saved and known data can reduce stress and give people more time to ensure that their data is correct and accurate. So I think when we talk about our style guides and our design systems, and we're thinking about inputs, like could we like designing an autofill. One thing that I would be careful of when thinking about autofill is like making sure that, it'll kind of pop up your suggestion below the field. If you've got validation on that and that's below the field, do we need to think about that validation message is then blocked? So again, we're adding sort of cognitive load for people to have to remember what that validation message was. So if we are thinking about designing an autofill, just make sure that's not obstructing any validation. Good examples of this as well would probably be if you've got like a billing and shipping address, make sure that someone can say, yes, my billing address is the same as my shipping address, just by like checking a box. Then that way they don't have to type it all in again. We know that information, we want to use it again, so just let them use it again. There are obviously exceptions to this, so sensitive data, security related fields, confirming passwords, so data that's essential and needs to be re-entered, or personal information that might have changed and that you don't need to store. So the adoption for this, so is this just going to be released and then we're going to have to make sure everything conforms to 2.2? Probably not is the answer. And the one example I want to give for this is the .gov. So they've recently released something called an accessibility strategy, and in that they kind of they mentioned 2.2 and how they plan to adopt it. And I think it's really interesting because obviously .gov work is something that we'd like to do more of, and we do tend to sort of refer to a lot of the .gov design system components when we're looking at accessibility best practices. So I just wanted to read this quick quote from the site. So we want to make these updates to WCAG 2.2 well before other service teams are expected to update their services. Once WCAG 2.2 is published, some recent changes to the public sector digital accessibility regulations mean that government-wide monitoring for the new WCAG 2.2 criteria will likely start in early 2024. A design system that aligns with WCAG 2.2 as quickly as possible will make it easier for teams to update their services to meet WCAG 2.2. So this was from a quote on the a link from a site on the .gov design system site. So obviously a lot of the government sites use this design system, use the components from that. So they're going to have to make sure that all those conform with WCAG 2.2 before they can then start rolling them out to all the different sites that use them. And then they might have to also spend some time creating new components that conform with 2.2. So I think that was like 6 to 9 months, and then making sure it's all rolled out. So that gives probably like about a year or so before they are actually going to start checking for 2.2. So I think that's quite a good kind of period of just getting used to it, adopting it, making sure, things are conforming to it. Do you need to change any components? Do you need any design changes? So it's not going to be a case of it gets released and we need to start doing it straight away. But one of the reasons I kind of wanted to give this talk is doesn't mean that we don't need to start thinking about it now. Like the further we can get ahead, the more we can start thinking about it, putting it into our new designs, the easier it's going to be when actually we think, right, we do need to say we now conform to 2.2. So how can we do that? Well, just collaborating more. And obviously we've got like the champions group, we've got the accessibility channel. And yeah, this is one that I've put on slideshows in the past. Like accessibility really does need all of us to kind of care and be aware and know why we're doing this and why it's important. So yeah, if you do want to get involved in those as well and help us kind of shape our approach to bringing WCAG 2.2 conformance into the company, then please do be part of the community. And yeah, that was it. Thank you.